No one is born without flaws, but he is the best who has the fewest of them. People often criticize me, but do you know what they never do? Address anything I've claimed and debunk it in a professional capacity. The alphabets and the mapping out of languages were priestly inventions, and kept secret only for those initiated into their mysteries. But eventually, the utility of these inventions facilitated conquest and commerce to such a degree that it couldn't be ignored, and other important classes were initiated into the priesthood for the purposes of learning their systems and doing their bidding. Among them were the navigators. The alphabets enabled people who didn't initially speak the same language to understand each other through the written system, and eventually teach each other till they could speak the same language. This is more efficient than learning the language of a people who didn't have a written system. By mapping out the languages with alphabets, it enables laws to be written and a nation's code of honor to be established and referenced. There is a system of priestcraft and governance that spread all over the world. There is not one civilized location that isn't organized and controlled using some form of these original systems. As they evolve and become rapacious, most people become overwhelmed in figuring out how to address the issues, but by understanding the systems and their origins, one can recognize where they were abused and taken beyond their ancient limits for despotic intentions. Knowledge of this system will not help for reckoning the chronology of prehistory, but if there are remains of a culture that existed during the last several thousand years, knowledge of this system can be of great use in making sense of the symbolism and artifacts found. Without question, the religion that caused the most bloodshed in Western civilization during the Common Era is Christianity. It cannot be ignored if we are to heal our culture and return to a way of life that doesn't cannibalize itself and is more aligned with being friends with our neighbors, countrymen, and other nations, as well as doing commerce with everyone while avoiding foreign entanglements. The following image is what Western culture looks like to the rest of the world right now. The dissemination of information at an institutional level was largely an inversion of the truth, and the correction of this is quite simple: restore the truth, make it available to everyone. Till now, information has functioned like a pyramidal power structure, compartmentalized so that only those at certain levels of clearance had access to it. There's even a classification system. The function of government ought not to encompass keeping things secret so we can't see what it does with our resources, and in our name. Secrecy is the problem, not for individuals, but for governmental bodies. Privacy is a fundamental human right, but we need to stop treating corporations and institutions like they are human. They should not be afforded privacy unless they are private companies that receive no benefits from the government or public. Information should be laid out on a proverbial round table where everyone can scrutinize it independently, and then let reason prevail regarding what we do about it. Most people are caught up in untruth and moral relativism, myself included. We are all hypocrites to a degree. Our goal should be to minimize the hypocrisy we engage in. If you can't define what truth is, allow me to help you. Truth can be defined by one word: facts. Everything that isn't a demonstrable fact should be removed from our education system, the same way evidence that isn't admissible in court is struck from the record. Might some good ideas be left out? Yes. But if those ideas aren't facts, they have no business in an education system that the public is exposed to. According to Arnott's CRIM Trials, page 368, quoted in Aiken's Life of King James I, Volume 2, page 167, in Scotland a greater refinement of cruelty in inflicting torture was adopted than in any other country. There the innocent relations of a suspected criminal were tortured in his presence, to wring from him, by the sight of their sufferings, what no corporal pain inflicted upon himself could extort from him. Thus, in 1596, a woman, being accused of witchcraft, her husband, her son, and a daughter, a child of 7 years old, were all tortured in her presence, to make her confess. The whole world's history, and that of our own country most especially, evinces how slowly and gradually even the outworks of Christianity have been yielded, and with what a pertinacious and sanguinary obstinacy not only the essentials, but the outermost fringes of Christianity have been maintained. Not 200 years is it, since Dr. Layton had his nose slit, his ears cut off, and 11 years imprisonment, for only writing a book against the juridivinoship of bishops. Not 20 years is it, that Unitarian Christians have been safe from penal statutes. And here am I, the tenant of a jail, at this moment, because my writings have not made concessions enough to Christianity to have been pleaded in mitigation of punishment, because my orations afforded no vantage ground to the tact of Christian sophistry. But, as in every individual, so in every country we find, the greater the prevalence of the Christian religion, the more rude the manners, and the more cruel the dispositions of its professors. Reverend Robert Taylor, printed for him in 1828, while he was imprisoned for blasphemy. Taylor wrote, Syntagma, page 94, Reader. See what Latin can do. Though by the by, it seems to spoil a man's arithmetic. 6 and 4 used to be 10, but and if a man had not more learning than wit, he could count but 8 in Christus, even with its Latin termination. But, take away the Asiatic termination, na, Krishna, and let Christ stand forth in plain English, and Krish and Christ are like enough to pass, the one for the ghost of the other. Sir George Birdwood wrote, they were at first but the obvious ideographs of the phenomena of nature that made the deepest religious impression on archaic man, such as the outstretched heavens above him, and the outspread earth beneath, both of which he naturally divided into 4 quarters, the east fronting him as he watched anxiously for the returning sun, the south on his right hand, the west backing him, and the north on his left hand, and this fourfold heaven and earth he signified by a circle, or a square, divided crossways, from which he was led to conceive of a heavenly garden, watered by 4 rivers, the equinoxes and solstices, and of a 4-square heavenly city with its 4 went ways, 4 portions of the year, and gradually to model more and more in their similitude the 4-square cities of antiquity, and those 4-square well-watered paradises. The Migration of Symbols, page 14. The original systems and religions are based on the most important system, nature. But they've been dressed up in so many lies as to be unhelpful to those who aren't taught their origins and significations. While it brings no joy to address the history of the priest class, it is unavoidable because the very tool that separated the Pelasgi from anyone else was the use of letters, which is why they were called the Dioi Pelasgi, or holy sailors. I suspect this a Greek corruption because the oi termination that signifies plurality in Greek is pronounced like the Latin I, which also indicates plurality when it terminates a word. Dioi, delta iota omicron iota, is a Greek version of di, meaning gods, which would be the Latin plural form of deus, meaning God. In fact, the Dioi Pelasgi signify the wandering gods, or the gods who wander by sea, which could be an allegory for the wandering luminaries, planets, through the sea of stars. I've already considered these possibilities, but it doesn't change anything because none of my work is staked on the title or name of the navigators from the Universal Maritime Empire. I don't care what they were called. Even if the stories around them are astrotheology dress up as history, I can demonstrate that there was a universal system that originated in Italy and spread throughout the world, and one which we still experience the effects of today. I don't need to rely on any accounts to prove this. The accounts that corroborate my work are merely icing on the cake. The Greeks do not use deus. They use Zeus and Theos, which, after studying the changes and interchanges between letters in different cultures and dialects, you should be able to recognize that they are the same word. The corruption may be a result of interacting with Latin culture by the time the description for the Etruscans, the holy sailors, was written, allegedly by Homer, who I do not believe was a historical person. But this is all minutiae that I could be wrong about, so I don't spend time focusing on it. The point I'm making is that, even in the alleged time of Homer, there are examples of Greek that appear to be descended from Latin and not the other way around, contrary to what we've been taught. Homer was claimed to have existed in the 8th century BC, but I suspect the work attributed to him is more likely inspired by the 4th century BC, again, something I could be wrong about. I've demonstrated that the likely origin of the Phoenicians is Sicily due to Punic being Sicilian Phoenician. But to get to Sicily and Carthage, and then to Cadiz, Britain, Armorica, the Bay of Biscay, and eventually the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and the Baltic region, they had to learn the craft of seafare, and the empire that dominated the Mediterranean was the Etruscan one, who the Greeks called Tyrrhenians, Tersenians, and Pelasgians. This skill of seafaring, in my opinion, originates in Italy because, if you look at the archaeological record, the transition from living in dwellings carved out of stone to building megalithic superstructures is present. There are a bunch of posts on this Substack that show picture evidence for those interested, but that information is for members only. It could be possible that the Sicilians, Corsicans, Sardinians, etc. have no connection to Italian people, and those regions were able to be accessed by land in a time before the Strait of Gibraltar was broken by the Atlantic, but that'd be during an era long before the civilizations I'm writing about, and thus a moot point. At this stage of chronology, the people on the islands near Italy are inseparable from the ancient Italian cultures. Those prehistorical ideas are fun to think about, but there's no indication of that region's topography drastically changing near the first few millennia prior to the Common Era, other than a decline in rivers and sea level, or a rise in the lands in some cases, likely due to volcanic activity, although there is lore of Sicily once being part of the mainland of Italy, before being separated by the sea due to an earthquake. There's no evidence of mass migration into Italy in the archaeological record, at least not during the era that the status quo needs it to be for their lives of Europeans coming from the Caucasus Mountains or Africa to be sustained. But I will concede that those areas of the Mediterranean that include North Africa, Eastern Europe, and Asia Minor were inhabited in ancient times by the cultures we call European. It's apparent, in the language and systems of civilization, as it is apparent in the British languages, that the Central Europeans have their origins from an Etrusco-Phoenician empire that preceded the Roman one. Wherever they were before that, if not in Europe, is something no one will trace in a manner that meets my standards because they won't be doing it through culture, language, religious symbolism, and all of the other staples of the universal system. The biggest challenge for modern people is that the systems for teaching language are generally boring and there is no application or interesting motivations for young people to learn philology. Without this knowledge, discovering the ancient universal system is impossible. It is the master key that unlocks the secrets of all cultures that exhibit diffusion with each other. It must be learned in order to see everything as interconnected, and once it is learned, you won't see cultures as different from each other as you do now. You definitely won't see alphabets as being so different from each other. This is useful because it's difficult to go to war with your neighbor. The ability to influence people to fight wars is largely based on demonizing other cultures because, if you can make them appear as aliens, or subhuman, it removes empathy and remorse, at least long enough to wage the war. It's only after the fact that people reflect on the bad things they did, and then it gnaws on their conscience. But by that time it doesn't matter because there's no bringing anyone back from the dead, despite the fantasy of resurrection that priests teach. Europeans are known for warring with each other. It begets the saying that all wars are brother wars. But perhaps they're able to do this because they don't realize how connected their cultures used to be to an original civilization, which, if they knew, they might afford each other with the courtesy that a healthy family or neighborhood affords its members, and then they'd resolve their issues without violence. Philology is the one area where I can help you see this. L changed into R. This is one of the most talked about and easy to demonstrate changes across cultures in Europe and China. Britain is no exception. But Latin seems to be the language in which it is done for the purposes of signification rather than a culture's general inability to pronounce the sounds, i.e., lex is law, and rex is king, hence the phrase lex rex, the law is king, as opposed to rex lex, the king is the law, but I do not know if this is a British invention or if it was taken from something in Latin. We also see the change in legal and regal, as well as loyal and royal. One of the stumbling blocks I've run into is that so much of what we call Latin is an invention of the Middle Ages and wasn't used in olden days. Lewid added, IB page 29, the Cantabrians or Biscayers in Spain, Basque people, whose language is presumed to be the ancient Spanish, seem to have affected the letter R beyond all other Europeans, as we find by their New Testament in the Bodley Library, wherein I observed that in Latin words they frequently changed the L and N into R. As a brief aside, this may beget the rare interchange of R and N that's seen in the Hebrew bar, br, and ben, bn, both signifying son, which would support my suspicion that Hebrew is a British system using a Chaldean syntax. I'm not sure if Lewid was aware, but since his publication, if not known previously, the Basque language was identified as Spanish Phoenician. Not only can you see the interchanges and similarity with Latin and other Italian dialects, but the Basque people use Etruscan words, and this is one of many examples that I use to prove that the Phoenicians were of Italian stock. This is another abject fact that was obfuscated by the modern people who created the construct known as Proto-Indo-European, something that doesn't exist in reality, whereby numpties make up the history of language and culture as they see fit, rather than just calling a spade a spade. Allow me, Ida is Etruscan. Here it is, written on a tomb in Italy as another appellation of Suri, the Etruscan Hades, spelled from right to left in the manner which old languages are written, dated to sometime around 200 to 400 BC, older than the oldest Basque inscription ever found. If you were to claim that Ida is a Phoenician word that the Etruscans borrowed, please provide the inscription in the comments. I want to see real-world artifacts, not what someone else claimed. I will recognize you in a subsequent correction, should I need to make it. If not, then it stands that Ida is Etruscan, Italian. When you see culture vultures like the Ora Linda crowd, who tow the status quo narrative of the Indus Valley origins of Europeans, claiming these archetypes, such as Minerva, Menvra, come from Freya's people, just remember that it's Italian in origin, not Greek. The Greek counterpart is Athena, which is not an accurate transliteration even though it is a literal one because it conceals the Italian and Celtic meaning, which is Athena, meaning from Tina, the Etrusco-Phoenician Jupiter, which is why you pronounce the eta in Athena like a Latin I rather than a Latin e. Minerva was the wisdom springing forth from Tina's head. This demonstrates that the Greeks took Etrusco-Phoenician mythology, not the other way around. It's not Frisian nor from the Bay of Biscay. It's not from anyone else, evidenced by the fact that none of the ancient Italian languages are like any of the other languages, yet all the other languages use the Italian alphabet systems. I mistakenly gave the Ora Linda crowd the benefit of the doubt till I experienced how dishonorable they are. They're as bad as the Tartaria crowd, but not as many, so their voices and content don't saturate the market. But really, any man of learning who looks at the system of writing in the Ora Linda cannot behold antiquity. It's not even a worthy endeavor for the attention grifters to associate with, which is why they don't. If you can't read the names on the following plate, it's your problem. You can't see the obvious because you're unwilling to do the work that will enable you to see it, despite me holding your hand and teaching you every step of the way. None of this is directed at you, the reader, if you have no intention of disseminating information to the public. But it's a big problem when those of you who go on podcasts, or host podcasts, speculate about subjects you clearly haven't done the work on, so that you appear more credible to your audience than you are. Some of you are experienced and well-versed in subjects that I know nothing about. Stick with what you know. The issue is not with you making a fool of yourself. That'd only bother me if I lent you my credibility by appearing on your podcast and the perception of us associating with each other is visible to the public. The issue I have is that others accept what you say, because people tend to believe those they admire, or who have social status, as well as anyone who can pretend to know more about something and pass himself off as an expert. The average viewer will repeat the nonsense, because they're consensus-driven, and then it spirals out of control and the lies take a life of their own. When someone demonstrates facts contrary to these erroneous ideas, people have vitriolic reactions, and it causes a dreadful experience, creating an environment where good researchers and scholars don't even want to interact with the public or share what they know because the responses are so wretched. I don't do that. I show you evidence. I may be wrong, but I show you what I'm drawing my conclusions from. I've been doing bar none, absolutely exceptional work over the last few years, the best in the world on this subject. If my work can't inspire you to look into these things on your own, then this niche is not for you to be speaking publicly on, and that's fine. Stay an audience member. But, for the love of Christ, get off the internet and stop speculating about history. The only way I'll have to eat crow is if everything I'm looking at is fake or forgery, and even that will be a victory for me because, if I can inspire enough people to look into this, where they demonstrate it's all forgery, then it means we've gotten to the bottom of the matter and have a legitimate place to start over with what we know and what we don't know, rather than whining about how we're being lied to. Just like with the scientific method, all outcomes are good because you figure out either A causes B or A doesn't cause B, or the third analogy, in this case, that B wasn't a natural phenomenon and we tried to determine the cause of something we mistook for one. Yes, we know we've been lied to. But we're not victims. We're victors. We've gotta own it. What are you doing as a solution? Making up our own versions of reality is not a productive way to counteract falsities. Lies do not get corrected by other lies. I'm doing the best that I can to demonstrate what is found in language, traditions, and archaeology that in ways that don't require the opinion or approval of experts. For those of you supporting this work and enjoying the ride, there's much more on the other side, including a potentially groundbreaking discovery in Etruscology and Greek archaeology. Become a member to access the rest of this article.